lauded 10 years ago for describing human evolution.
There are two things that are inevitable: birth and death. As life, we define the area that lies in between. And in this area, we have all kinds of experiences. We grow physically and mentally, develop ideas and needs, and change the world according to our abilities. We perceive ourselves, and over time our ego develops simply because we evaluate our surroundings and we want to satisfy those wants and needs. This ego therefore grows in size over time, which is easy to understand as more and more is added. I think you can sympathize well with that, since you also build an ego while building your personality. But what happens at the end of life? It's all over with death. We can't take anything with us, no matter how much money, power or toys we have in our lives. As we know, fear builds up in us over time, not only because we will lose everything, but also because we don't know what's coming. And you know what that means. Everything unknown creates fear in us. Fear that we don't want and that even harms us. At a young age, we don't yet have the right feeling for life. It's easy to suppress thoughts of an end. But the more time we have lived through, the more precisely we can assess it. And the clearer our feelings become, and with it the fear. It is therefore worthwhile to think about how this misery can be avoided from an early age. Nowadays it seems that distraction and displacement strategies are indeed a tool of choice, but is it also an appropriate tool? Hardly, because in the end that doesn't help anymore either. At some point we can no longer suppress our look away from the inevitable. And the later we realize that, the more problems we get. Therefore, after carefully consideration, the only option we have left is to decompose our ego at some point. Without a doubt, we need it at a younger age to assess ourselves, to gain courage, to propagate values and ideas, simply to be able to act. But the question you will eventually ask is, when should we start to break down our ego again? And how will that make the most sense? And of course, everything has to have a purpose. Nature also helps us with this question. The ideal time for a departure from ego can only be determined by the type of attitude, the moment in which we no longer primarily take care of ourselves, but of our children. Some will say that is no longer the case nowadays, since there are institutions such as kindergartens and so on. Of course there are. After all, we are masters of suppression. But how much sense does it really make to give our children away? And even if they are not directly with us, aren't and shouldn't your thoughts, values and feelings always be with them? And even if they are in school, studying in another city, or even if they have already started a family, parents know what I'm talking about. And it was only after the birth of my daughter that I thought different about these things. No wonder I wasn't ready for the next phase in my life, so the time of the ego waltz is when we start a family. But in order to be able to do that, we have to fulfill prerequisites. We actually have to be willing to put new values and things above our own ego. Need to find a partner who is right for us, in which we learn to form interpersonal connection, to put the partner's relationship and needs above our own ego. We just need to know what love means. But the prerequisites for starting a family are also based on deeper abilities. So, we must first create values and beliefs that enable us to take this step, to make this decision. And we can only do that if we also have enough experience and enough knowledge and skills to be sure of being able to hold the future family. Quite apart from the fact that we have to find the right partner, in which we have to find our way around in groups and convey and share values and ideas. The point at which we have met this requirement defines another transition from one stage to the next in every human life. So, we learn to act in order to find a partner and to be able to provide for family. However, in order to protect yourself and others from the necessary actions, not to harm yourself, it is necessary for each action to understand its evaluation, being able to assess and weigh them up and recognize limits. We learn to recognize the limits beforehand in a further phase of life. And we do it step by observing the consequences and effects of our actions. These are becoming increasingly complex and potentially more dangerous for us and our environment. And they become more and more complex the larger the group of people affected. Moral concepts therefore also arise in this phase of life. Only in this way we can form and maintain groups at all. Only in this way we can develop and try out increasingly complex actions. In this way we can learn beyond ourselves. I know this is getting confusing and exhausting, but we also only have two areas left before birth. On the one hand, we must have confidence in ourselves that we are allowed to act, and we still have to see ourselves as individuals so that we get the motivation to want to act at all. These two stages of life are in the beginning of everyone's life, and I don't know anyone who remembers this time in their life. But it is beneficial, if not extremely important, for parents and their children to be aware of and support their children. As I have already indicated, it does not seem to have been a problem for me to successfully complete these two areas. Determining my and other limits was also not a problem. I had a little support because I was quite weak due to my illness as a young child, and I was teased quite often and had to take a lot. Of course, that showed me some limits, mine and those of the others, and it made me think about my own actions. I didn't want to hurt others. I knew how it felt. Maybe this combination is the reason why I never stopped wanting to understand my environment, rather the whole world. I quickly created a model of physics that was supported for me, and so, purely by accident, I began to deal with completely new questions. Today, it is clear to me that that time was simply ripe for the next step. Maybe you can understand that. In a consequence, I began to become more and more interested in my own psyche through the organ of the brain. And like I've done in the past with my interests, I don't focus on much else. I meditated for several hours a day, built up mind machines, partly from computers I own from my youth. Here you can see me, for example, building a so-called soundboard to enhance the effect of my mind machines, because you couldn't buy anything like that back then, at least not to the best of my knowledge. And if I had, I certainly couldn't have afforded it as a student. I don't want to scare anyone here. Almost nobody will understand what I mean, but it was definitely a turning point in my life. I mean, the day my whole meditation practice culminated in an encounter with God. Sounds pretty weird, I'll admit, but that's exactly how I feel, and accordingly there wasn't much going on with me in the next weeks. I was studying electrical engineering at the time and was actually still fully immersed in the physical world. I had to process a lot afterwards because my world view had never changed so drastically, so quickly. Today, of course, I know that it wasn't God, but it was the highest level of meditation that I had reached without knowing it. Describing what I felt is going too far here and is even more confusing, but without a doubt, things changed in my life. Just like when I finally managed to leave my body, after 3 years of training. In technical terms, this phenomenon is called out-of-body experience, or OOBE. And if you are now thinking esotericism, you are completely wrong. My mental foundation is and was logic and rational thinking. Today I can say that even with a neutral, analytical approach, you can experience things that you probably cannot even dream of. The only requirement for this is the question, what if? So, if you don't limit yourself and at least keep yourself open to everything, for the time being, quite a lot is possible. You don't have to accept something new as a fact at first, but you can try to discover and understand it for yourself in an unbiased, neutral way. If you don't manage to get past a selection, to understand something in general, it is because you lack experience or information to understand. Then the new resource will not be available in life, and an unsettled search for the missing piece of the puzzle begins. This means that if someone was unable to complete a phase of life successfully because they did not understand what is important at the time, then confidence in the ability of the previous phase disappears. Exactly this point has to be worked up. Only then can it be understood. In technical terms, this is called regression. In example, going back. At the beginning of the video, we talked about displacement, the fact that in the end we couldn't take anything with us. This becomes clear to us the moment we realize that time does not stop for our bodies either. I don't mean the small wrinkling around the eyes, but massive restrictions. Now, at the latest, displacement is becoming increasingly difficult. This is when the last phase of life begins, letting go. And we can only do that if there is a solid foundation. Hopefully, we have worked this foundation in the course of our lives. Otherwise, we will have ultimate problems. This basis includes helping our children to go their own way, to build their own values and belief systems, to pass on our knowledge. The idea that one day my child should have it better than me bears witness to the fact that development is not only extremely important in one's life, but also in everything else. Only through them do we become satisfied and fulfilled. But in the physical world, there is not much more to achieve for a person at this stage of development. Material things are increasingly losing their meaning and are in principle always the same experience. The person will devote himself more and more to his spirituality. Again, I don't mean esotericism, but have you ever thought about what the difference is between a good book or film and a bad one? One or the other inspires you, gives rise to ideas and desires, and the other is boring and tormenting. Both are invisible, an invisible force that resides in the book or film. What I mean to say is that spirituality starts with a good inspirational thought, starts in the mind, in the spirit. Where spirituality ends is different for everyone and changes over time. Of course, this also depends significantly on the experiences that have been made. What if there is no end? All this forms the basis for the last stage in human life. The more incomplete this foundation is, the more likely a part in the last section, through age regression, tries to quickly work around something from the past sections, or to understand things. Another strategy is resignation, which often ends in depression. I'll say it again. For the last stage in life, it is not only important to understand life, because that's what life is all about, but also to adapt one's behavior to the respective stage. The exercise of having to let go of each selection helps when the time comes to finally be able to let go. If you now have the impression that life ends with the family, I would like to make it clear that this is not the case. While there comes a point when you shouldn't pay as much attention to your ego, That doesn't mean your identity disappears. Only the ego is getting smaller. Your identity, what defines you on a higher level, ultimately includes more than just the ego. Perhaps you have already noticed that the experience of passing on knowledge, of protecting children, of creating values and things, of caring for other people is more satisfying than anything else. Don't panic, almost everyone has difficulties with the whole thing. Even I, who thought about it a lot, had to take my lesson. And that was another turning point in my life. Today I can laugh about it, you notice it. These points are often expressed as strokes of fate, but on closer inspection they are only indications of what is still pending at the end of an area of life. You can say as an assistant of fate, which arises quite automatically and safely if we don't stick to the natural pattern. We just have to perceive it. It can't be anything else. For example, I had also focused on my ego for a long time because understanding the world is also triggered by ego in the early years. And I was also very open to material things. So I bought a sports car, which I've always wanted to have as a child. I should have developed in a different direction because fate then showed me the way, quite painfully. I had a serious accident on the freeway. To this day I can't say how fast I was, but I was fast, and the car broke. Now you could say, no wonder, always these sport car nuts. But I drove rationally and accordingly carefully, apart from the speed. And then someone else made a mistake that I couldn't compensate for, and my spine was broken, along with a few other injuries. And again, things changed. One night in the hospital, I knew what was coming. I didn't know why, but I knew I wanted a child now. I was so close to death that I wanted life, a new life, and that's what happened. In 2009, our daughter Lulu Ko'ipo was healthy born in Hawaii. Since then, I've really understood how difficult it really is to understand, but I openly engaged in it every day.
Aber ich lasse mich jeden Tag erneut offen darauf ein.